Hello and welcome to And Did Those Feet, the podcast that reflects on the golden age of English football between 1945 and 1970, the end of the war and the defeats by Germany in the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. And today we're going to talk about money. And it's a strange thing about this period, really, because there's so much innovation in the 1940s and 1950s. So many things change. New stars emerge, like Pele, new styles of playing like four at the back from the Brazilians or the Hungarians with their deep lying centre forward. New technology comes into the game. Television for the first time, 1953, the Matthews Cup final, the first game to be televised, first cup final to be televised. Floodlights come into the game, which enables clubs to play evening fixtures during the season, which matters in terms of revenue in crowds. New competitions emerge. So many new things in the European Cup, for example. The World Cup becomes. So this is a period where football changes radically and dramatically. But money is a permanent feature throughout this period. And in particular, I mean, there's clearly features like, you know, transfers go up, wages go up, and so forth. But in particular, I think one of the things that strikes you most forcibly about the 1950s is the extent to which the top players, people like Tom Finney and Stanley Matthews, and somebody we're going to talk about in detail today, a fellow called Neil Franklin, uh, the extent to which these people think they're being ripped off, the extent to which they think the game is making a huge amount of money, but none of it is coming through to the top players. And there are numerous anecdotes where, for example, Stanley Matthews is on his way to a game against Scotland in Hampden, and he stops at Crewe for a cup of tea and a bun, and it's one and threepence, and he puts it on expenses, and he gets told, and bear in mind, Hampden Park, 130,000, he gets told, if you want to have a cup of tea and a bun, you can have it, but you're not putting it on expenses. This is the kind of thing that really enraged the players. So we're going to talk about money and its impact um, on the top players in particular throughout this period. And then we're going to come at the end to talk about the abolition of the maximum wage because up until 1961, even the best footballers in the land could only earn 20 quid a week. So it's quite a big agenda for today. How are you doing, Karl?
Yeah, very well, thank you, Peter. And very much looking forward to talking about the subject of money and football in this period because, as you say, it really is a crucial factor in how the game developed.
One of the things that we just brushed on very briefly there was transfers, and it's worth just sort of making a note here that transfers at the end of the war, the record transfer fee at the end of the war is 15,000. By the time 15 years have gone by, let's take it to 1960, it's 100,000. And by the time we get to 1970, it's 200,000. So those are huge gradations and huge developments um, in the way that football and money get interrelated with one another. And if you bear in mind as well, as we were saying, that the maximum wage goes out of the picture in 1961, it's clear that clubs have got plenty of money with which they can pay wages. And in fact, I would say that if anything, the proof in the pudding was in the eating that the players were right. They were being ripped off. And the most perhaps egregious example of that is Neil Franklin. Let's talk about Neil Franklin then as an example,
Yes.
just as an example of what happened to the top players in the 1940s, 1950s, if they aspired to a standard of living which was more commensurate with what they were achieving as players. Give us some background for Neil Franklin, Karl. What's
Yes. So Neil Franklin at the when football started again after the Second World War, Neil Franklin was a centre half for Stoke City. I suppose to be clear, because these sort of descriptions names change over time. We're talking about a central defender. And he was very much top draw. So he played for Stoke and he was England's first choice in that position. By all accounts, I think he was a player, it's fair to say he was somewhat ahead of his time. He was very much a ball playing defender as well as being a great defensive player, somebody who I think was frustrated a bit by being told by his manager at Stoke to rein in the ball playing a bit. But I think it's fair to say that if you were talking about the best central defenders ever to play for England, Franklin would be right up there.
Oh, yes, I think so. Yes. I mean, one measure of his brilliance is the fact that although England had something like nine selectors, I think I'm right, that was a panel of selectors who picked the team at this period. And therefore, the team was constantly chopping and changing because there was no two, never came to the same conclusion twice. Franklin was one of only two players to be ever present for the 5 year period from the end of the war through to the 1950 World Cup. He's picked 27 times for England in 27 matches, and as an index of how different things were after he was banned. That was just getting ahead of ourselves here, but in the subsequent 10 years, in the subsequent 10 matches, there are 10 different centre halves are picked. They just don't have a replacement for him. And but let's go back. So, what exactly why does he fall out of favour with the powers that be? Then, why does he find himself banned from the game?
So what had happened was it's really one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of world football. I think it's a story of El Dorado, which is that in Colombia there was a rebel league that took some of the best players in the world from various countries. So Colombia was new to professional football. There was a dispute between the amateur league and the professional league. The amateur league appealed to FIFA and got their way in that the professional league was expelled from FIFA. So it kind of happened by accident. The professional league hadn't wanted that situation, but the clubs quickly realised that they had an opportunity because being outside FIFA meant they didn't have to worry about the contracts of players from other countries or about paying transfer fees. So they had more money to pay directly to the players. Now, most of these players came from South America, especially Argentina, where there was a great deal of instability. But there were a handful of players from Britain who ended up going to Colombia. One of them, perhaps the second most famous, was Charlie Mitten, who played for Manchester United under Sir Matt Busby. But the one who was the real star was, as you say, Neil Franklin.
I mean, let's get this right about Neil Franklin. He's the equivalent. If there's one footballer from more recent times that he reminds me of, I don't know who. Whether, I mean, is that I'm just putting that in front of you. Does anyone strike you?
Well, I mean, I wonder whether it might possibly be a player from the 70s and 80s. Maybe Alan Hansen.
Alan Hansen, I quite agree. Alan Hansen is exactly because, and I would say it's a cross between Alan Hansen and Bobby Moore. He's that good. He's the sort of player. Yeah. He's the sort of centre half who comes off the pitch with no mud on his kit. You know, everybody else is covered in mud, and it's not because he's not mixing it. It's just because he doesn't need to do that to win. He really is an exceptional, and it's remarkable in many ways, Karl, that he's so forgotten because.
Yes, I mean, Stoke are hardly a club that have got a great history of winning things. They came very close to winning the league.
Second in the table, second in the league.
Yeah, they came very close, and Franklin undoubtedly was a huge factor in that. Maybe the most important factor.
He's exactly the sort of player you could build a team around. I mean, I think the fact that he's been forgotten so much is almost certainly, you know, sort of almost. I mean, without sounding too paranoid about it, it's an establishment cover-up. Okay. He didn't cover himself in glory because of the timing of his departure to Colombia. Should we talk a little bit about that? That's sensitive, isn't it? I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, so he went off to Colombia, where the money that he was on was way in excess of anything he could have earned in England. So he was offered a signing on fee of £1,500, and the equivalent in England at that time for signing on fee would have been £10.
Yes.
So the disparity is absolutely huge.
He got 3,400, or rather he was promised 3,400. I don't think he got it. I don't think he got much of what he was promised. In England, he was
Yeah,
on 12 quid a week. So it's just
yes,
no comparison at all. But go back to the question of timing, because it's just before the 1950 World Cup, isn't it?
of course, yes.
And that's
So
it's a real letdown in many ways. I mean, let's be honest, I'm a great admirer of Neil Franklin, but the timing is disastrous because England have built their team. They don't want to really, it's the first time they've entered a World Cup. They're regarded as, I think they're regarded as second favourites for this one. Brazil are the favourites, England are second favourites. England have built their team around Franklin and Billy Wright for the last 5 years. And really, it's like at the last minute, it's during that summer. And he's not absolutely honest about it either, is he? In fairness, he's not absolutely clear about why he says he's not going to be going to the World Cup because his wife is pregnant. He's going to be looking after her. And well, that
that's
wasn't quite
right.
true.
Yes,
That wasn't quite true.
yes,
So he
yes.
had his
Yeah.
flaws, I think, as a man, but as a footballer, he was a sensational player. Sorry, I've interrupted you.
No, 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 not at all. It's that's a very good point about how important a figure what he was in the England team and how damaging that must that must have been to the side. And of course, the 1950 World Cup's notorious in England for the fact that England had that astonishing defeat to the USA. I mean, who knows how much difference
Yes,
Franklin
no, you
would
can't
have
say you
made?
can.
But I don't think it's pushing it much to say he must have had at least some impact on the on a side where he was central to the way England played.
Well, central too, because centre half in those days was regarded as a kind of pivot. It was not only a defensive position; it was also an attacking in the sense that, rather, I suppose, as we might say, a quarterback kind of role.
Yeah,
If I understand that term correctly, which I probably don't. But the idea of that also triggering attacks, spraying the ball to the wings, very, very important for England with people like Matthews and Finney in their team. So you can imagine how, I mean, he'd played at the same club as Matthews at Stoke City. You can imagine how he could have been absolutely, I mean, he no doubt was absolutely central and to their plans. And alas, he wasn't going to be there. Now, let's not get away from the fact there's one reason alone that he's there, and that's because the money is right. And it's
yes,
the only place in basically on the planet that's going to pay him what he thinks he's worth. And these players are worth, top players are worth colossal sums of money. Bear in mind, Tom Finney, who is the best player I mean, he's again, Preston, he's best player in Preston's history. He's paid 12 or 15 quid a week and is known as the Preston plumber because he has to maintain his work
very top
as a
income.
plumber
Yes.
in order to be able to play to be able to afford to play football. And he gets an offer from Italy to go there to play for a significantly larger slice of the cake. And he's told by the Preston chairman they'll play for Preston or they won't play at all. That's the
That's
deal
right.
that the players are offered. And this kind of brings us to um, the contracts that the players had to sign and the terms on which they represented their clubs. By the way, as far as Franklin is concerned, it seems as if he really wasn't paid very much at all of what he was owed. He was promised immense riches. I've
I,
heard it said he
yeah,
played
and he lasted no time at all. I think he played 6 games.
6 games. He played 6 games, and he before he
Yeah,
came home, and he was paid for one of them. I've heard. So I've read.
right. Yeah, I didn't realise that. I
He was
didn't realise
completely.
he was
He had
told.
no money, and of course, when he came back to England, uh, well, they threw the book at him. To begin with, he wasn't picked by Stoke. You don't think he played another game for Stoke actually.
No,
He was stuck on the transfer list, and he was eventually sent off into the second division to play. But that is, and of course, he was somewhat. Well, of course, he never played for England again, although he hoped to. But this was the punishment which the FA imposed on a player who they felt had let them down. And well, in
because
some
I
ways, they,
suppose his sin was not so much that he was taking so much money as that he was exploiting the fact that the retain and transfer system didn't apply to the Colombians
No, indeed, yes.
because they were outside FIFA. Whereas you were talking about Tom Finney. I mean, I think Preston did take the offer very seriously.
Right.
So I think Finney was about 29 at the time, and I think it was very much a debate among the board as to whether they should take the money because it was a lot. I mean, it was a lot of money for them. They were being offered in 1952 30,000. And so Finney could have earned a fortune there, but well, I think partly it's that Finney was a decent man who followed the rules, however much he might have thought they were unjust. But he wasn't allowed to go to Italy because, of course, Italy were in FIFA,
Yeah.
and because of this very important um, um,
Yeah.
retain and transfer system,
Yeah.
Preston owned the rights for Finney with regard to football. If, as you say, if Preston wanted him to play somewhere else, then he couldn't play somewhere else.
No, that's right. The terms under which, I mean, the terms that Neil Franklin was effectively trying to escape from were absolutely shocking. I mean, I think there's no exaggeration to use the word shocking. When you look at the terms under which players were employed in the 1940s and 50s, by until the end of the retain and transfer system, it takes your breath away. It is remarkable. So, a player who wants a transfer, well, if the club doesn't want to transfer him, he's going nowhere. A player that is happy at a club, but the club wants to transfer him, then he has to be available and open to being transferred. Player who is, I mean, well, it's striking that one of the players who I think it might be Charlie Mitten actually comes back from Colombia, and he goes back to his club because he's got no option. He's still his registration is still with the club, and when he when the club decides, have resolve what punishment they're going to impose on him, do you know it's 25 weeks and no pay? And this was quite common. I mean, in fact, Wilf Mannion, who's a great inside forward of just the years after the war, he
Mm.
goes on strike at Middlesbrough, and because he wants to get a transfer, and the club simply say, "Well, fine, you got," and so Wilf Mannion goes back to the shop that he runs for 6 months, no money coming in because Middlesbrough aren't paying him. Um, you can. There were really precious few obligations on the clubs at all. They
Yeah,
operated effectively a closed shop. And when you see the terms and conditions under which the players, you almost laugh out loud at the absolute absurdity and inequality of it. And I mean, I think this process, which is triggered by, let's be honest, it's triggered by Neil Franklin and his type, by players grumbling in the dressing room, effectively, comes to an end with Bosman. And when you read the sort of the way that players were treated in the 1950s, I don't think you would think then, as
I mean,
what
there's a
now,
story. There's a
that the
story from the
players have too much
1920s.
power.
Yeah, I mean, there's a story from the 1920s, which is a good while before um, our period, but I think it's relevant because the rules were the same. And it might be apocryphal. I think there's some doubt cast on it. But the great baseball player Babe Ruth is supposed to have come to England and met Dixie Dean. And he'd been to a match and seen the size of the crowds and said to Dixie Dean something like, "Wow, you guys must be on some money." And I think Babe Ruth was somebody who had an interest in money. And Ruth is supposed to have said, according to Dean, when he heard how much money the footballers were getting, that you guys must be idiots because Ruth was on something like $70,000 a year,
Yes.
and the the footballers were barely paid more than the working man, as it were.
No, indeed. Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. Yes. I mean, in fact,
So that story, whether it's actually true or not, I think the disparity in the money is certainly
I mean, I
true.
think that English footballers at that time had a disinclination to rebel. I think they were conformist. The whole country was quite conformist. It was quite a sort of tolerant and accepting society. But at the same time, to give some some index of what we're talking about. Um, the maximum wage was 20 quid in 1960, 20 quid a week.
Yes.
So you got the best footballers in the country playing for 20 quid a week in front of crowds. I mean, some of these crowds, by the way, this was a golden age for crowds. Manchester United's
Absolutely.
record crowd is set in something like 48, isn't it? It's
That's
at
right.
Main Road, I think, and it's 80,000.
Yeah.
And if you think that Scotland games routinely brought in 130,000, and incidentally, I think you can, if you want to know what that was worth, in terms of revenue, I reckon you can calculate at 10 bob per. In other words, you go to the game, it's going to cost you 10 bob. So 130,000 equates well over 50,000 quid was the revenue from an England-Scotland match or a Scotland-England match. And yet
Mm.
these players, I mean, you do the maths, you've got 22 players and 3 officials, 25. So if they're being paid, I think they were being paid about actually 25 quid or so for the
Yeah.
match. It does go up to 50 actually, in fairness. But I mean, you can do the maths there. There's something like 50,000 in revenue and something like 5,000 in outgoings. Obviously, there are other outgoings too. But you can see why the players were fed up and thought that they deserved a bigger cut of the money that was being raked in. And I think as well, when you consider that on the whole, on these, I think my impression is that when teams went abroad for a fly off, that the squad would turn right as they entered the aeroplane, and the Blazers would turn
Yeah.
left. And you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And that is another thing that must have irritated me. But I was just going to give an index of what the money was worth. In 1960, the maximum wage is 20 quid. Well, George Harrison's dad, who was a bus driver for Liverpool Corporation, was on 10 quid a week. So a skilled art in
Yeah.
1960. So, and by the way, the Beatles playing in Hamburg were on 45 quid a week. And Ringo, when he was offered to join the Beatles, I know this is a bit off topic, but when he's offered to join the Beatles, they offer him 25 quid a week. So you get a sense there of, but
Yeah.
I think a telling comparison is the bus driver's on 10 quid and the best footballer in the country is on 20 quid.
And bear in mind, presumably the bus driver would have been paid £10 at least throughout the year, whereas the footballer's maximum wage went down in the summer months.
It did. It did. It did. Incredibly. I mean, how people made ends meet, I don't know, but I well, it was a struggle. I mean, that's the same, the plain fact. And then then came retirement at the age of 30. And so there
Mm.
was no safety net for these players. And so I think that that Neil Franklin has really been sort of blanked by this footballing establishment. But what he set in train, I mean, who can blame him for what he now? All this culminates in two court cases or two effective, let's call them, let's do two campaigns. One is by the Professional Footballers Association, led by one Jimmy Hill, who
Yes.
take on the establishment, and it get they initially they're quite conciliatory, but the establishment, the Football League, effectively, have no they're not really there to negotiate. They're there to try to avoid a situation they don't want to get into. And and in fact, as I think gradually as the negotiations continue, the footballers get more and more militant until the point comes when they vote on whether or not they're going to strike in pursuit of. So this is to abolish the maximum wage altogether. They don't want the maximum wage there. And the vote is something like 600 to 19, I think it's something, those are the figures. They're
Mm.
absolutely ready to strike. And at that moment, the Football League gives way on the maximum wage. And from now on, players will be able to freely bargain with their clubs and say, well, what am I worth? I mean, I think it was the form of words was that players be free to bargain for the largest amount of money that the club is willing to pay them. And well, fair enough, Johnny Haynes goes straight to the top of the class, £100 a week footballer, the first £100 a week footballer from 20 quid a week. Johnny Haynes, England captain, Fulham player. Now, but not everybody, I think, Karl, would say that the abolition of the maximum wage was a good thing.
Well, it's very easy to see the iniquities of it, but I think one thing that it did lead to was a more level playing field because it meant that what you might call smaller clubs from towns and as well as cities, could compete because there was a ceiling of how much money they could pay. And interestingly, I found a quote from way back uh, in the 19th century from a chap called J.J. Bentley when he was Football League president, and he was talking about the maximum wage. And he said, quote, that it prevents a rich club swallowing up all the talent and so reducing the competition to a mere farce. For it is obviously to the advantage of the league as a whole that the club should be as nearly equal as possible in strength. Now, I think that was undoubtedly true. And you can say that and still recognise that a maximum wage was unjust and unsustainable.
Yeah.
And in the just as a to illustrate that, in our time period of 46 to 70, the league wasn't competed for in the first of those seasons. So there were 24 league seasons. 11 different clubs won the league.
Yes.
In the last 24 seasons, as we talk now, 6 sides have been champions of England.
Yes.
And there were 25 FA Cup competitions in the period that we look at. 17 different clubs won the FA Cup in those 25 seasons, whereas in the last 25 seasons, 8 have won the FA Cup.
Yes.
And I think that's got to be overwhelmingly because in modern football, money is very unequal among the clubs. The richer clubs can buy the better players. Somebody like Tom Finney would have been vanishingly unlikely to have spent his whole career at Preston. Ditto Matthews at Blackpool or Lofthouse at Bolton, etc., etc. They would have gone to Liverpool, Manchester United, Arsenal, whoever was the bigger club at the time. So the maximum wage, it did, whatever its faults, it did help to keep the English football much more competitive and much more of a level playing field between clubs.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, that is absolutely true. And that's actually borne out by the statistics for the 1960s, because who wins the league in the 1960s? Well, apart from Ipswich in 63, which is a bit of an outlier, I would say. The other teams that win the league are all from basically from large cities. Tottenham from London, Liverpool and Everton, who win it, 4 times between them, from Liverpool, Manchester United and Manchester City. I mean, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? Whereas in the 50s, you get teams like Burnley winning the league. I mean, that was a bit of an exception, but nevertheless, didn't West Brom win the league in 54? And there were many more opportunities, really, I would say, for clubs, as you say, from towns rather than from cities.
Yeah.
And so that is undoubted. And let's be honest, the concept of the maximum wage hasn't actually been, the idea behind the maximum wage hasn't been discredited. I think I'm right in saying that English Premiership rugby, until about 5 years ago, had a maximum wage. And I mean, there's a lot of salary capping that goes on in rugby. I mean, certainly in Welsh rugby, there's salary caps because there has to be, because the money is not infinite. So the idea of the salary, of the maximum wage and the salary cap, hasn't gone away. And it hasn't been discredited. It's just that I think in the context, it was applied with such brutal force by the Football League and by the clubs in the sort of later years, the 1950s especially. At the time, you see, one of the things that I think is going on at this period with the players is that they are beginning to recognise that their fellow professionals in the outside world, let's say teachers or nurses, have rights to, are able to control that to some extent their own careers, are able, if they want to move on, if they want to have a contract, they have a contract. And what was happening with the footballers was that none of that was true. The principles on which they were being employed were really the same. I mean, they were the same as had been laid down by the Football League in its first flush of its youth in 1901, and nothing had changed. And therefore, I think, what the footballers were doing in the 1950s were trying to bring this up to date. And it's striking what opposition they met from the people who ran the clubs and ran the league. Well, so Karl, I think that's a bit of background to the terms and conditions under which football has operated in these years. And if there was, I mean, I think these were inspirational years for play, a great time to play football for a professional level in every way, except for the sort of financial, and that's
Yes.
obviously of seminal importance. And so, but there's much more to talk about as far as money is concerned. Let's talk about transfers, transfer fees, and revenues from other sources for the European Cup, from floodlit football, and so forth. Next time we meet to talk about the golden
Yeah.
age of English football um, and did those feet. Thanks, Karl.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye bye now.
Bye.